Welcome to the program. Today we spoke to the president of the Asia Institute, author, and 2024 presidential candidate Emanuel Pastreich. What exactly is the LGBT movement, historically, and what forces might be controlling it today? Hi, welcome to LiveONETV. I'm Ian Carpenter, and I'm here with our guest Emanuel Pastreich. Emanuel is a presidential candidate in the 2024 election. Welcome, Emanuel.
Thanks for having me today, Ian. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
So am I. We're going to be talking about sexual identity and the alphabet of LGBT and all the other letters that have been coming after that.
Right.
Okay. How can we start? You've done some research recently and published a paper on the subject. Can you tell me about that work?
Right. Well, I've been preparing a speech on this topic, and I really wanted to speak to the American people about how we got here, and how we should understand.
I used to just call it the gay movement, but I've read your essay that you published, and you were able to help people see the transition through history on how we've approached gay, lesbian, trans, and other identities as well. At one point, I had no problem with it, the LGBT, but I think it's gone quite beyond that.
Right. Well, I think my sort of confusion there is not because I'm ignorant, but because many of us have a certain psychological hesitancy to buy into this sort of prepackaged ideology that doesn't really describe human nature and is being used as a political tool, even those who I would say are progressive or even leftist. So maybe the best way to look at this is to see in American history how we got here. So we have a Constitution, Declaration of Independence, a excellent tradition of America was truly an experiment in which we had a constitutional republic, which had no royalty, no aristocrats, and also was based on a democratic process. It was not governed by a church like the Catholic Church. And so really something which had been dreamed about since the 17th century, but had never been realized before. However, the American experiment was not perfect. We had slavery, we had discrimination against the native peoples, and other terrible things that were done. Nevertheless, America, this experiment of a truly constitutional republic that's democratic and non-aristocratic, inspired the French Revolution. It inspired the revolutions in Germany in the 1840s. It inspired the Paris Commune. And I mean, for that matter, the independence movements in Vietnam, in Korea, and around the world, in India. So it was tremendously important. The problem was that in the next process, that is to say, the demand for equal rights, civil rights for African Americans, for Native Americans, and then for women, there was some complexity to the process. Not all who advocated for the civil rights for African Americans supported the right of women to vote. These were sometimes different groups. And also, the people advocating for the rights of women were not necessarily supporting civil rights for African Americans. Also, many African American groups did not embrace the cause of Native Americans. And this continues to this day. We have African Americans vocally demanding reparations for slavery, but not finding common ground or advocating for reparations for Native Americans, which I personally find to be a little bit strange. In any case, the ideas of expanding constitutional rights to African Americans and to women has precedence in world history and civilization. It has I think, a real legitimacy. It took a couple hundred years to get it right, but I think it's the right direction, and it's been verified and I'd be basically accepted today. Granted, there are people who are always using emotions and biases for political purposes. The problem came up on the issue of gay rights, what we'll call general gay rights. This started out originally, I think, in a totally legitimate way, that there was an effort in the post-war period, I think from 1950s to 1970s, by the American Psychiatric Association to designate homosexuality as a disease, a mental illness. And so there was an ongoing effort for several decades to change this, which I think is totally legitimate. We don't really understand homosexuality well. It has multiple factors, and it varies from person to person. Some people see it as a basis for identity and affiliation with others. Some don't. But it was clearly not simply a mental illness, and the discrimination against people who were designated as mentally ill for this this aspect of their personality, their preferences, was really wrong. The next step, starting in the late 70s, especially in the 80s, was to get to end discrimination against people for their lifestyle, for being openly gay or not openly gay or lesbian, bisexual, and this I think also had constitutional, institutional precedents and moral philosophy as well. However, it was pushing the envelope a little bit, I would say, at that point. But it has legitimacy. The point at which we crossed over is when we went basically from the 1990s to making same-sex marriage institutionalized and something which governments, the United States government, for example, or other countries, should recognize as being the equivalent of marriage between a man and a woman.
Yeah. Please continue. I think it's a great that you're taking this along in a very logical way.
So on that particular issue, there's a sort of genealogy that's been written by certain people today, would say on the left, although certainly not amongst conservatives, but not all leftists agree with it. And the genealogy is fight for civil rights, women's rights, and then finally gay rights. And gay marriage is a sort of culmination of this full recognition of the rights of people who are gay or lesbian in their orientation, their lifestyle, or their very nature, their culture, and their personality. Different people will look at it different ways. However, there is another argument to be made, and that is that marriage as an institution, a union between man and woman for the purpose of establishing a family, even if you don't have children, having a family unit, which is the central unit of society and upon which government is built and modeled upon. That is to say, the institutions of how a family is run, a mirror or serve as a basis for how a government is run, how we run ourselves, how we run our society. This is ancient and is a fundamental part of how society is structured. At the same time, the concept that same-sex people can get married in the same way that men and women can is virtually unprecedented in human history. It's a totally new concept. And this idea that this was just a continuation of this sort of liberation ideology from the civil rights movement, from the women's rights movement, is not entirely convincing. Moreover, I think we have to recognize that many of the central figures in civil rights, for example, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, others, believe very strongly in family, in male-female relations, often in a very strict sense, and that this, I think, for none of them did they think in any sense that their effort was going to be related to some effort to make same-sex marriage equivalent to normal marriage. Moreover, the left, which had argued for civil rights and for women's equality, let's take in the two cases. First, in the socialist or communist bloc in the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, and other Soviet or socialist blocs countries. Do you think these countries at their height in the 1950s and 1960s were saying we should have gay marriage? No way. They advocated extremely conservative mores for family life. Man, woman, married, faithful, in a very traditional healthy and positive, constructive family relationship. And that was seen within the socialist bloc as being the core to a healthy society. So to say that gay marriage is leftist means you have to sort of throw out a very large part of what leftist thinking was. At the same time, many of the leftists in the United States or in Europe, with the exception of certain groups, say in the Weimar Republic, also did not take that position that gay rights or gay marriage was certainly not gay marriage, but even gay rights was not central. Moreover, traditional leftist thinking, for that matter, conservative thinking, took the issue of cultural and moral decadence, the decay of institutions, the decay of values. I mean, Lenin talks about decay of values as a critical issue. Many of them certainly would perceive what we're doing today, I'm talking about the left, as being quite dangerous. And the danger is a complicated one. And I guess I would throw out, when we're talking about this issue, something like a possibility. I don't know, by the way. I'm not taking an absolute stand on gay marriage at this point, just voicing some serious concerns. But it is possible that although the individuals in the same-sex marriage may be very respectful of each other, may be contributing to society, may love each other, may have a relationship which is better than, say, heterosexuals around them, that it's still possible that the promotion of this new, totally unprecedented institution slowly is destroying the foundations of our civilization, causing a sort of slow rot, which then affects the rest of society in a negative way. And I think this issue, if you talk to traditional leftists, say in the 1930s and 1940s, they would probably have taken that position, that it would have been seen, that sort of activity, say if you in the 1930s or 40s, by leftists would have been seen as an example of sort of capitalist, imperialist, indulgent, decadent behavior. So I think this effort to identify this gay marriage and beyond as being the rallying cry of leftists is a very historically specific development.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. And there also could be put into the discussion, often people talk about the family as the most important core, but there is another idea that it isn't the family that is the core, but it is the relationship between two people. In other words, the marriage, because with parents and children, it's kind of a one-way street. It's not a reciprocal arrangement of, contributing to each other. Although you could make the argument that babies, just by being cute and loving, are providing that reciprocal exchange. But it is the successful or the happy marriage where you can really see the reciprocal energies going back and forth as a measurement of success.
Absolutely. And by the way, I'm not saying that you have some sort of moral obligation to have children, but I do think that the idea of marriage as being an institution, which is critical for a healthy society, is something which we should take seriously. And that if we look at the tradition of leftist thought, that there isn't much precedent for this idea that gay marriage is something that has to be. And that brings us to the next stage in the evolution, which was the final, beyond gay, lesbian, bisexual, and that is transgender.
And you could even say with man and machine, whether
Right.
the state wants to legalize a marriage between a human and a machine in 10 or 20
Well,
years.
I mean, I think there's an intentional efforts to push the envelope in these efforts. And I think what's really important for the American people to understand is that, yes, there are some people who believe this fervently. There are some arguments to be made for it. But there are also hidden forces in the United States who are using this confusion about gender identity, sexual identity as a weapon to attack the citizens of the country. And there were many studies done, both within government, within research institutes like RAND, DARPA, Department of Defense, et cetera, to see what issues of identity and self awareness. And it has been shown through extensive research, this is also corporate research, that one of the ways to create a population which is passive, which is incapable of organizing itself, incapable of responding to challenges, oppression by tyranny, is to attack identity, right? To confuse people as to who they are and what their relationship is with those around them. And attacks or confusion about sexuality and sexual identity is a classic technique for undermining people's identity and weakening their ability to respond politically.
Wow. Yeah.
So that leads us into the transgender world. So as you know, there were it's not entirely like COVID-19. It's not totally made up, right? There is some basis. There are viruses. There is influenza, but it has been twisted out of shape. So we originally had gender dysphoria, which is a tragic disorder affecting almost exclusively young boys, in which they feel that they are a woman trapped in a boy's body. It affects some tiny part of the population, 0.001 or very small number. And there were only, I think in 1985, only like 2 centers in the entire country to treat this condition. The number of people identifying transgender status, which has now been expanded, has gone up, I think, 1,000% or more. And it's become almost epidemic in the same way as COVID-19. And so it doesn't really make sense. And we're led to, we don't know the answer ultimately, but it seems as if it's being force-fed to the population. We're getting these sort of transgender images in the media. It's being fed to us by public intellectuals, TV shows, and the whole, what I would call the fake left, who have embraced this. I think probably in return for our actual cash payments to promote this transgender agenda. And it's like COVID-19. Its basis in reality and science is even more tenuous. It's not truly clear what exactly it is, and it allows for extremely subjective definition of identity and sexuality, which allows, for example, create an enormous crisis, allow men to suddenly play women's sports, go into women's bathrooms, including engaging in rape and assault in those cases, and has created tremendous tensions and splits within American society, which again are just what the doctor ordered for keeping us from organizing in opposition to this massive concentration of wealth in the United States.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it does seem, I can't say it's not a natural evolution, but it does seem like there are some special interests who are pushing these agenda, who are not necessarily the same people who are exploring their sexual identity. It seems like there is an input from a different group that is using them. And I don't know what you think about, we often think about, not having these things directed at children, that children be given a kind of safety period to develop their own critical thinking, rather than moving into a child's life before they've had a chance to do a lot of observing, that they've had a chance to see things for a long enough pattern of time to comfortably figure things out for themselves. It's interesting, this period of time, whether it's babyhood to 10 years old or babyhood to 16 years old or 18, but that we leave children alone so that they have a chance to observe things around them before they make, as they form their decisions about who they are and who they want to be. Does seem, we had just around the corner from me here in New York, I live in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's district, and we had a public library that sponsored a drag story hour for 3-year-olds, and it might even still be on the library, which is a government institution in New York. I went and checked it out for myself, so this isn't hearsay. On the library website, it said drag storytelling for 3-year-olds. And I went on to Facebook and I put a tweet in one of these groups. I said, is this really the way that we should be doing things? Because 3-year-olds, they're still trying to coordinate, and balance themselves. You know what I mean, right? They're trying to balance their bodies still and not fall over. And it seems a little bit, it seems tremendous. It seems wrong to me for especially with government funds. I mean, if a parent and a family wants to have these conversations and take their kids to drag storytelling, I think that's within the family's right to do so. But to have the government funding these kind of things for 3-year-olds just seems absurd to me.
Well, it is absurd, but I think probably the most accurate explanation is it really is an operation. It's not limited to what's being done in schools or what's being done by the government. Young people are now subject through cartoons, through TV shows, through movies, through any number of different, including games that they play, to any number of stimulations, not only to cause gender confusion, but to also cultivate a perception of sexuality as a form of consumption, as a form of narcissistic indulgence and self-centeredness, essentially taking love and family and affection out of the equation. And I really think that they're multiple. It can be seen as part of a sort of late imperial decadence and decay, which I think is part of it. But it can also be seen, I think, as a very wise, canny strategy of multinational corporations, banks, and the super rich to try and find ways to undermine youth, because youth are potentially the leaders of movements for serious political change. In fact, you would say the most amazing thing today is that we have so few youth involved in political movements compared with, say, what we had in the 1960s or in other periods in American history. And I think part of the reason for that is a very savvy, informed, even scientific identification that youth are the ones to be targeted, both to attack their identity through this sexual identity politics, to undermine their ability to think for themselves through addictive forms of social media and pornography, games, etc., and then to attack sexual identity, which is a very, very powerful weapon for undermining cohesion for the individual, for family, for groups.
Yeah, I'm following you.
So I think that the real step is to recognize that this is going on, and I mean, obviously, I don't have proof I can give you on this show, but I would not be surprised, or I assume, based upon my considerable knowledge of how the U.S. works, I would assume that many, if not all, of the public intellectuals who are talking to you about gender issues, transgender, pushing or somehow arguing for the need for hormone blockers or hormones or surgery, that they are in one form or another being paid off to push this line. That there may be people who naively go along with it, but I think that many of the central figures who have promoted this are doing it as paid agents, and that at the same time, sadly, the criticism, say from the conservatives, from the Christians, tends to identify the problem as being the radical left, i.e., these crazy leftists, crazy communists, crazy Marxists, whatever they say, and that this is obviously not really the answer. It's not totally wrong, but it keeps you from focusing on the real target. And clearly, when Donald Trump and his supporters say something like, transgender is a product of the Marxists, they have not been reading any Marxist writings. They haven't looked at what was practiced in the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China, which was far, far, far away from any sort of transgender ideology. So it's a created enemy. This, it's created, but it's actually become real as this is human nature, right? People start to practice things. They start to believe in them. Even ideologies which have very flimsy foundations can start to get, wings or legs of their own. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I would sympathize and understand that there are young people out there who feel that they're transgender, that this environment has been created. They respond naturally to it. And I sympathize for them. I think they should not be subject to discrimination. It should be addressed in an understanding way, but that we as citizens have a moral obligation to seek the truth about what's happening. And the truth is not that suddenly all these people are discovering they're transgender. The truth is that there has been an agenda which goes back to the 1960s through corporate research on mass manipulation of the population, and that transgender agenda, and to some degree the gay marriage agenda, was seen as a perfect tool. As a political figure, someone running, this was one of the topics when I ran in the Green Party that I was told was the third rail. Never talk about this topic because they'll come after you, especially if you're running as a progressive figure.
I was told the third rail was Israel by somebody else.
Israel, that's true. Well, that's not true for the left, though. I mean, so on Israel, we could have a different session on. So Israel, in certain respects, is not a third rail on the left. You can bring it up if you're focused on Gaza. Yeah. If you're talking about other aspects of Israel, it is a third rail. However, so I mean, leftists will talk about how terrible what's being done in Gaza is, as will some conservatives as well. But they're not going to talk about how Israeli firms are training American police, right? Or how they control power grids in parts of the United States. I mean, the whole, other topics like that. So
Yeah.
it is still taboo, but the certain subjects regarding Israel are okay on the left and to some degree on the right. But the problem has been that the transgender agenda has been just, it's like a poison pill. I think it really destroys from within. I mean, a lot of people I know have spoken that even people who support gay marriage, which I'm obviously more skeptical about, but that to have the teacher reading a text to your kindergartner saying, Molly has two mothers or whatever, that this is really beyond. It's not appropriate. It's not appropriate. But it's a logical extension of
Some people would say that's brainwashing, right?
yeah,
For a young,
but it's a
for a
logical
younger
extension.
person.
It's the problem with gay marriage, right? That once you go to gay marriage, you're institutionalizing it to a degree that allows, by logic, to say, yeah, sure, we should, introduce this idea to everybody because now it's the law of the land. It's how things are done, and that is profoundly, I think, it's quite risky, regardless of the individual relationship between a couple, which may be ideal, but that humans are not simply defined by relations between two people, right? It has to do with mores and practices within groups of people in society as a whole, and that government, institutions, schools, whatever, are founded upon relationships between people, which at the most basic level for the last 10,000 years are based upon the concept of the family. Family may vary in its meaning, but to fundamentally alter that relationship is sort of like, going in the basement and for fun, smashing a couple bearing walls. I mean, you might have a much wider basement where you can put in a bowling alley, but there are going to be consequences.
Now, Ron Paul thought that marriage should be taken out of the government's hands, that if people want to get married, why do they have to go down and register with the state? What do you think about that, that we remove government from marriage?
Well, it's I don't have a prepared statement on that particular question, but I think in order for that to work, we'd have to have sufficiently robust community relations that it would be meaningful, and that we have, for better or worse, over the last 150 years, become increasingly dependent on government and or corporations to play this role for us. So in order for that, I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility, and it might be better to do that, but you'd have to have institutions that were strong enough, a church that's strong enough, a community, organizations that are strong enough to actually make it viable long-term institutions.
Yeah.
And the United States is not there now.
Right. Well, if we took government out of marriage, people would have a ceremony, and there would be laws that would protect them as well. And if you saw this movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, there was a scene in the movie where he gets married, and it was a simple ceremony outdoors where they just wrapped a cloth around the bride and the groom's hands and had a marriage ceremony. And so I can see marriage occurring without the government, but the people have the laws still protecting them. And
Well, so I'm open to the suggestion for the reason that laws and government over the last 20 years have been so corrupted and so undermined as institutions that we really have to rebuild the United States from the ground up, right? We can't expect someone to become president and suddenly magically we're going to restore a constitutional republic. It has to really be from the bottom up. Run your family well. I mean, this is, I guess, in some ways a conservative view, but run your family well, run your community well, follow certain ethical standards in your behavior, and that will radiate up to create a more accountable local government and, by extension, accountable central government. But that if you're counting on the government in the state of corruption that it's in right now to somehow regulate you, this is getting less and less tenable. So I am open to that idea you just suggested, but I don't have a policy on it, and I think it would not be simple. We'd really have to rethink what government is. But at the same time, we're going to be forced to rethink what government is, because government today is a wasteland. Large parts of it have been outsourced to corporations. What remains of it has become sort of like gangsterish, self-serving factions, syndicates fighting over scraps. Government of the people, for the people, and by the people is really not what we're looking at. And we can get back there. I think it's certainly possible for people to do that. But I think the first step with regards to government is not to deceive ourselves by saying, like sort of Bernie Sanders, well, if we don't take a stand now, we're going to lose democracy, or something like that. We're going to lose our democratic processes. I mean, Biden says that as well. But rather to say, we've already lost democratic, accountable government. We don't really have a democratic, we have an authoritarian government, and we're going to have to start working with what we have to get back to some sort of accountable government.
Yeah. And it isn't just to the conservative community versus the far left. You know, in the 60s, there was also a struggle between, I'm going to use an extreme and say rednecks, but rednecks and hippies. And that was a real divide that you could see an example of in the movie Easy Rider at the very end.
Great movie.
Rednecks. Yeah, a wonderful movie, but a very tragic ending where a so-called redneck pulls a shotgun out and shoots a couple of hippies on their motorcycle.
Often a tragic, I think, misunderstanding, since a lot of these groups had so much in common.
Sure. And
there was,
do you remember the sensation of the movie Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, when a couple of people went into the Appalachian Mountains and one of them ends up getting tied up and raped by I can't forget the banjo music. What was that called? Foggy Mountain Breakdown or something on the.
I don't remember. But it has been a tragic. There's a lot of tragedy involved in our history.
Alan Turing.
Yes.
And I heard. Do you know when he was chemically castrated? Do you know that was in the 1950s? To me, that's not too long ago. That's unbelievably tragic situation where this guy helps save English people, and because he's attracted to a man, ends up being castrated and committed suicide.
There was a lot of what I mean. It had, in the case of Turing specifically, there were various things that were very inconvenient. Specifically, cooperation with the Soviet Union on intelligence issues, and many people who were involved in that, probably Turing and people around him, were intentionally destroyed as part of the process, because I think the government in Britain or the United States didn't want to recognize what had actually happened. They rewrote history, and in fact, the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States until 1945, and then suddenly it was the enemy. But politics like that is, in a way, too harsh, and so sadly, I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying. I fully sympathize with the way in which people, for their personal choices in their life, have been subject to discrimination, to, this pseudoscience, like with Turing, crippled, persecuted, and it was wrong. It should not happen, and people should have their basic rights protected. The jump from that to saying that gay marriage is equivalent to heterosexual marriage and should be institutionalized, or to saying that gender is something you can, based upon your own personal sense of identity. This is, I think, a totally different dimension.
Yeah. Well, I do like the tolerance that I've seen. I do like the fact that so-called marginalized people are participating more in society. I think this is a really good thing. But when there are third-party actors or doing operations on the rest of us and manipulating, you could make the argument that that's evolution too. That a third party comes in, that it's natural as well. But it seems an interference is happening, and conversations like this can create consciousness where people are aware of what is actually input that's coming into their lives and community, and who's putting the input in, and why those people might be putting that input in.
I think the efforts of various, say, private intelligence firms like Booz Allen Hamilton or Cassie or others, to working with Homeland Security, anti-disinformation budgets to try and undermine political activism that's outside the Democrats and the Republicans, using sexuality, or for that matter, racial identity as a tool, is extremely prevalent in the United States. It's almost unspeakable how broad this is taking place. In the case of identity politics, it's become extreme. And I think it's calculated to try and get people fighting each other. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, in the United States, in the 1890s, for example, in Wilmington, with famous coup d'etat, where the fusionist government was overthrown. But the fusionists was a group which brought together black and white working class people who had much in common, and they were quite successful. And there have been other efforts like that. So something of this identity politics is not about righting what is wrong or empowering in minorities, but it's rather about class issues, keeping people separated so they can't come together to make common demands.
I agree. And I think that it leads to the discussion on a one world government. And I think I'd like to say that a one world government is not necessarily awful. It's a question of what type of one world government. Absolutely. And that's what I think we're at. Now, do you want a one world government where General Dynamics or the multi-billionaires of the world are controlling the world and manipulating the populations, or a different type of one world government?
Well, that is a difference between this critical difference between globalism and internationalism. And that's one of the reasons why, for all the evils taking place today, I do not fundamentally oppose the concept of the United Nations. That it has, in its original mandate in the charter, it plays a positive role, and it has played a positive role over the last 60, 70 years. But it has been bought out by those for this one world government. And the problem in much of our rhetoric, especially in the conspiracy circles, is there's a sort of assumption that they're building towards a one world government. But if you're working for private equity, for Vanguard or BlackRock, it's already there. I mean, the one world government's already there, and it's not. It's not in the United Nations, and it's not in the White House. It's in a bunch of shared supercomputer centers around the world, where these financial institutions, whether it's Vanguard or Blackstone or or State Street, or if Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Oracle are compiling enormous amounts of information to manipulate us and our finances and our economies. So those supercomputer banks running things have already essentially established a world government.
I would agree. And it appears that what is being set up is a digital surveillance prison
Absolutely.
to maintain these powerful entities. And there's a concept that if we haven't already crossed that line, then any minute we're going to cross a line where our chances of escape are nil or greatly reduced.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And that if you see it from that sort of bird's eye view, then it's crystal clear that the hyped up issues about identity and sexuality identity is sort of like a distraction to keep people from focusing on the big issues. I mean,
Right.
what would a billionaire want more than for working class people in Tennessee to be mad at working class African Americans in Chicago about some perceived injustice, or for people to be alienated from their children or from their neighbors because of some concepts about sexuality, marriage, church, whatever. This is what they want. This is exactly what they want.
Right. And there's also now the story that just came last week is Abraham Lincoln, they're saying now had a gay partner. And did that get into your news feed? Oh, yeah.
Well, so he did live with someone before he was president for I think like 10 years, and they slept in the same little room. But I think, I mean, it's probably just speculation that it might be true. I mean, I don't know. I never read anything about it, but I did read several biographies of Abraham Lincoln at a certain point in my life. And there was, I think, the story about how he lived with one person, maybe a law partner or something, for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be it was gay, but it also could be that, things were quite different in the 1840s than they are now. And although it may seem strange for two men to be sleeping in the same bed in the same place for 10 years today, that in 1840, maybe it wasn't so strange and didn't necessarily mean what it's come to mean in our highly sexualized, highly commercialized society.
Right. We forget what things were really like versus our interpretation from photographs or drawings from the time period.
It's a serious problem, and I think there's a tendency to project back, but it certainly is conceivable that relations were quite different. People had much stricter ideas and mores. Not to say funny things didn't happen, but that some of the things that you just assume today may not have been the case 150 years ago. Anyway, I really wanted to thank you, Ian, for giving me this opportunity today to talk to everybody and to take on one of those taboo subjects, as it were.
Yeah, I appreciate it too, Emanuel. And I've read your essay and paper on this. There are things in the discussion today things in your paper that we didn't bring into the discussion today. So let's do that again real soon, okay? And maybe we can get into this subject more. It's
I appreciate it. And that's, I think, really want to make the basis for my campaign is to address head on and directly the real issues, and to do so in an honest manner, to be sympathetic to those who have different perspective and different experiences. But I think the evidence for massive psychological manipulation in the case of COVID-19, in the case of 9/11, in the case of the use of mass media is so overwhelming that to assume that somehow gender politics and transgender is immune, is not related to those operations, would be truly naive.
Okay, we've been talking with Emanuel Pastreich, who is a presidential candidate in 2024, and you can visit his website, EmanuelPastreich24.org. Thanks again, Emanuel. Let's talk again real soon.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking with Emanuel Pastreich. You can follow his presidential campaign at EmanuelPastreich24.org. And don't forget to follow LiveONE.TV, an accurate source on world news and politics.